this module, we are going to be setting up Grafana for visualization. So in our previous module, we were able to set up Prometheus to collect our various metrics, and now we'll be setting up Grafana to enable us to do the respective monitoring of resources. Now, for us to do that, we are going to come back again to understand our Prometheus and Grafana learning repo. And in our Prometheus and Grafana learning repo, we have some basic configurations. Now, with these, if you scroll right down in the repository, you can see that we've been able to set up some basics. We've been able to set up Prometheus server to help us monitor our resources, or where to gather the logs from our respective targets. We're able to come to our AWS console. We created targets. So let me take running instances. We're able to gather targets from our AWS account using Prometheus script metrics, or service discovery. So we have two hosts. We have our server web and our app server. Here is our Prometheus. This corresponds to the two active servers, the web server and the app server. Now, we've set up our Prometheus server to collect logs from those respective targets using service discovery. What we are going to do now is we are going to be setting up monitoring and data visualization with Grafana. For you to understand basically what data visualization is, if you come here, let's take any of the instances. If I take the web server here, I copy the web server public IP, I open a new tab and I paste the server IP. Remember, Node Exporter was installed on port 9100. So if you come back here, we can edit port 9000, or we can input port 9100 to take us to Node Exporter. So this is Node Exporter, and here are the metrics. If you access these metrics, you can really have little or no information about what is actually going on. Maybe if you want to know more on what kind of metrics is being collected, you can do Control F. Control F means find. So in the find, we'll just say CPU. So if you want to search out, these are some metrics with respect to CPU. These are some metrics you can search out. These are metrics with respect to CPU. But now we cannot see all those metrics visually. We don't know actually what metric is being collected for CPU and all of that. So with the help of Grafana, which we are going to set up for each of these active targets that are up, we are going to be using a dashboard that is going to help us to visualize. So this is the basic Grafana learning repo. If you come to the Prometheus Grafana setups, if you open Prometheus Grafana setups, you should see the configuration files to install Grafana. For us to install Grafana, we are basically going to use this shell script install Grafana. This will help us to install Grafana, and because our shell script is using sudo apt-get, we'll be installing Grafana on an Ubuntu instance. So this will set up our Grafana server. So to get started, let's come to our AWS console. Within our AWS console here, we are going to take launch instance, and then we are going to call this instance Grafana server. And because our user data here has apt-get, we are going to come to our instance configuration and we'll select Ubuntu. When we select Ubuntu, we'll choose Ubuntu 22.04. You confirm changes. Basically, we have the Grafana server, and then we are using Ubuntu 22.04. And now for the instance type, we are going to use T2 medium just to ensure that our server will be fast. We're going to use T2 medium for our instance type, T2 medium. For the key pair, we use a key pair we have access to. You can choose a key pair you have access to. So I'll be selecting the key pair I have access to. And when you select the key pair you have access to, under networking settings, we click on edit settings. In our public subnet, so you can select your VPC. Under subnet, you can select your public subnet. In our public subnet, we are going to be creating a new security group, and we are going to call the security group Grafana Learning SG, corresponding to the security group which we are using for Grafana study. So Grafana Learning SG. So I'll copy this and then I'll use it as the same description, and I'll paste it here for the description. Now, what are the ports? We are going to allow port 22 by default to be able to access and see what Grafana actually is running on. And then equally, to know Grafana port, you can open a new tab and search for Grafana port. If you search for Grafana port, you will see what port it is being used. So how to change Grafana port from port 3000. Basically, you can change the default port from port 3000. So Grafana is running on port 3000. The default Grafana port is 3000. So once we are setting up our EC2 instance, under instance configuration, we have our source type TCP running, where we can SSH into the server, and then we'll be adding a new group role. When we add a new group role, the source type is still TCP, but we are going to put the Grafana port, which is port 3000 for Grafana. So Grafana is running on port 3000, and then for the source type, we choose anywhere IPv4. So basically, you click on network settings, you click on edit, you choose a public subnet, you allow auto assign public IP enabled, you give the security group name Grafana Learning Security Group, You give it the same description, and then you allow port 22 for access to SSH in case we have troubleshooting, and port 3000 for access to Grafana on the web browser. Now, once we have all three set up, the next thing we have to do is for us to add the user data. So you can click down, you have under advanced details, you click on advanced details and you scroll down. You can come back to Prometheus and Grafana setups. Under Prometheus and Grafana setups, you could just add the user data by default. So I'll copy this user data, or I can click on copy here. It shows copied. I'll come back to the instance launch and I'll paste the user data here. So we have sudo apt get install this, and then we are getting the package for Grafana. We are running the Grafana daemon, start the Grafana server, and then we can see the status or enable the status for Grafana. So as you have this, to summarize, we have the Grafana server name, we have Ubuntu 22.04, we have T2 medium for the Grafana instance type. You can use your key pair should in case you have to troubleshoot or SSH into the server. We have the Grafana launch in the public subnet, the security group name Grafana Learning Security Group, the description Grafana security group description. You want to enable port 22 to access issue in case you have troubleshooting, and then port 3000, which is the default Grafana port. And of course, you add the user data. The user data was the last thing we added. You come to the Prometheus and Grafana learning repo, you copy this user data, you come to launch instances and you paste the user data here. When you come here, this is a summary. We are launching one instance, the software image, canonical Ubuntu 22.04, T2 medium, and then we have the new security group which we'll be creating. So once you have these basic configurations, you take launch instance, and this should create our Grafana server. So we have successfully initiated launch of instance. This, if you click on this should take us to the Grafana server. That instance corresponds to our Grafana server that has been created. Now we have to access this Grafana server on the specified Grafana port. But before we do that, we need to give it some few seconds or some few minutes for Grafana to initialize. So I can refresh this to see if Grafana has been initialized. Grafana instance is still initializing. Let me see, reload. The instance is initializing. We can test access while it's being initialized. So I can click here on the checkbox. I'll copy the Grafana public IP. I'll open a new tab. Again, I come to the Grafana instance here. I can refresh this. You select the Grafana instance, tick here, you'll be able to copy the Grafana instance public IP. I copy the Grafana instance public IP. I come to a new tab and I'll paste the Grafana instance public IP, and I'll specify the Grafana port, which is port 3000. So now I have port 3000, and then I'll hit enter. So you take me to continue to site. So our instance is still initializing. Let me come back to our EC2 console. I'll refresh the tab here while we are waiting for the instance to say initialize. So you see initializing, basically it's still running the configuration setup which we specified. So we have our instance still running. Let me refresh this and see initializing. I'll come again to our Grafana server. I'll refresh to see if we can access the UI. So it's still loading. We come back to our EC2, we refresh the state, it's still initializing. You can come back to this other tab. So you have to wait till the instance is actually initialized before you'll be able to access Grafana on the UI. So let's give it some few minutes for it to initialize. I'll come back here, I'll refresh. Let me scroll up. Okay, our instance has passed the 2-on-2 check. I'll come here, I'll reload. Let me delete this and open a new tab. So I'll just come to Grafana, I'll copy the public IP, open a new tab, I'll paste it and specify port 3000, and I'll hit enter. I cannot access it from this browser, so I'll try to access it from another browser. I'll copy this, right click, copy. I'll use another browser. If you're using Opera, whatever browser you're using, you can use another browser to try to access Grafana service. So I'll paste this here and I'll hit enter. So it still cannot be accessed by using the second browser. So let's SSH into the server to check why we are not able to access the server. So what we'll do is we'll come to the Grafana server, we select connect instance, and then we select SSH. Again, we came here to the Grafana server. If you come to instances, because we are not able to access on our dashboard, you select the Grafana server, you click on connect, and then you pick the SSH. Now once you pick this SSH, we are going to open our terminal, and you get to a directory where you have your key pair. So if I come to my PWG, I have my key pair in this current directory on my desktop. So I'll paste the command to SSH into the server. Once I paste the command to SSH into the server, I'll hit enter to get into the server. Take yes to get into the Grafana server, and if authentication is properly done, I'll be in the Grafana server. It's an Ubuntu server. So I will check if the Grafana service is up and running. I'll clear my screen and I'll do sudo systemctl Grafana. So you see, oh, I did not put the systemctl correctly. It should be sudo sudo systemctl Grafana. So I'll hit enter. Means Grafana has not been installed. Grafana actually has not been installed despite us passing the user data. So we are going to install Grafana manually. And for us to install it manually, we are going to do git clone. We come back to our repository. This is the Prometheus Grafana repo. We click here. We'll be using this repository. We'll just clone the repository to install it manually. So if you click on Prometheus and Grafana Learning, what I'll do is I'll come to Prometheus and Grafana Learning. I click on code, and then I get this repo, the URL. I'll copy the URL. I'll come back to my terminal and I'll do a git clone, and then I'll paste the URL here. So it means I'm doing git clone. I want to clone this repository. Once I hit enter, it should automatically clone the repository. If I do an ls, I should be able to see Prometheus and Grafana Learning. So I've successfully cloned the repository. Now, once I've cloned the repository, I'll cd into the Prometheus Grafana Learning. So I'll take cd, I'll get into the Prometheus Grafana Learning directory, and I hit enter. Once I get into the Prometheus Grafana Learning directory, I can still do an ls just to be sure of the files which I have there. I have the readme file, and I have the Prometheus Grafana setups, which is like the installation configurations. So once I have these installation configurations, I'll cd into the Prometheus Grafana setups again. So once you clone it, you have Prometheus Grafana Learning. You first cd into Prometheus Grafana Learning, which is the parent directory. And then after that, if you ls, you'll see now the other content within the original directory. You see we have our Prometheus Grafana setups. Once we have Prometheus Grafana setups, we'll cd into this Prometheus Grafana setups and we hit enter. If you hit enter here, you do an ls, you should see all the files. We have install grafana.sh, install node-exporter.sh, prometheus.sh, and so on. So for us to install Grafana, we'll just do sh, and then we type install tab grafana tab sh. So let me reduce my terminal so it can be very visible. So for us to install Grafana, we are cd into the parent directory, which is Prometheus and Grafana Learning. We are cd into Prometheus and Grafana setups, and then we are running the command sh install grafana.sh. So as I hit enter, this should automatically run all the installations. Should in case we're not able to install it using our user data, we just install it manually, which is the process. We are currently doing the installation manually, and because we've done the installation manually, we can see that the service is active and running. Now we have the service active and running. We'll come back to our console here. If we refresh the Grafana, we should be able to access Grafana on the web server. So you now see we are able to log in. So you see it's loading. Grafana is currently loading. Now when Grafana loads, this is what the Grafana UI looks like. Once you get into Grafana UI, we are just going to enter the username admin, and then the password. You enter the password admin. This is the default password to get into the Grafana dashboard. We have username admin, we have password admin. Now once you've put in those basic data, admin for username and admin for password, we click on login, and you see login successful. Now you're being asked to input a new password, so we'll just use admin because we are still in training. So we give the password admin, and then we confirm the password with admin, meaning that every time we want to log into the Grafana server, we can use admin. Now once we have these basic configurations, we click on submit. Once you submit, you should be able to access the Grafana user interface. So we are welcome to Grafana basic tutorials, data sources, dashboards, and so on. So this is the basic Grafana user interface. In our next module, you basically have to walk through around Grafana and then configure Prometheus as a Grafana data source.